My name is Michael Dukakis, the former governor of Massachusetts, and I'm the chairman of the Boston Global Forum. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to another in a series of discussion sessions that we are having, featuring a particular expert in the field, and at the same time inviting many of you from all over the world to join us in this discussion. First, a word or two about activities on the part of the forum. Since our last discussion of this kind, we've had a very good meeting and discussion with Professor Jose Barroso, former president of the European Commission. He contributed excellent advice to us, made a number of good recommendations for the work of the Commission, especially as we look forward to the G7 summit, which will be taking place in the spring. And we're particularly grateful to him. He was the president of the European Commission for 10 years and attended the summit 10 years in a row, and we look forward to working with him. Today we are very honored and privileged to have with us Professor John Savage of Brown University in this third online dialogue. And I want to say thanks to Professor Savage for being a part of this and for contributing to it. He's the Anne Wang Professor of Computer Science at Brown. And for those of you who don't remember or know Anne Wang, an extraordinary person in his own right, another one of these immigrants who came to this country as a young man and made enormous contributions to us, to information technology, and particularly to Massachusetts when I was governor. Professor Savage is a fellow of the AAS and the ACM, a life fellow of the IEEE. Don't ask me what all those letters mean. A Guggenheim Fellow, and has served in a number of important capacities as an expert to the United States government. His current research interests obviously are important to us, especially his focus on cybersecurity technology and policy. And that's one of the reasons why we've invited him to join us. As many of you know, one of the purposes of this series is to see if we can help the international community and all of us to focus on how we deal with cyber terrorism and whether or not we can begin to develop a code of conduct, standards of conduct, which not only begin to deal with this problem, but if at all possible, avoid a kind of cyber Cold War, which seems to be building. And we're particularly privileged to have Professor Savage with us and to get the benefit of his counsel. He'll be speaking to us for several minutes, and then we'll go out to all of you across the international community and ask you to participate in this. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Savage to us. Professor Savage, thanks very much for being a part of this, and we're very honored to have you with us.
Thank you, Governor Cox. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I am going to entitle my talk G7 Cybersecurity Agenda, but as you'll see, the focus will be on dealing with misuse, malicious use of the Internet. So, can you see my slides? Are they available now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is the outline for my talk, which I expect will take about 25-30 minutes. I'm going to spend a few minutes on the question of best practices. When the Internet began to occupy the attention of governments, which was in the early 2000s, it was thought that the most useful thing they could do was to distribute best practices. So I'll say a few words about that. Then I want to talk about cooperation in handling cyber incidents. It doesn't matter what kind of incident it is. If it's a major incident, it's going to be necessary, I think, in most cases, for governments to cooperate. Then I'm going to spend a substantial amount of time discussing norms to mitigate malicious behavior. And then I'll take up the question of encryption, which is in the news every day now. I will conclude with a discussion of model for Internet governance and some reflections in the Munich Security Conference. I had the pleasure of attending that conference a week ago, February 11, 12, 13, with the U.S. congressional delegation. It was headed by Senator McCain. I was there at the invitation of Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island. So on the question of dissemination of best practices, let's begin with the point that it's important for all nations to maintain a high level of cybersecurity. It doesn't matter what your outlook is, your philosophy. If your security level is too low, then you are going to feel handicapped, and you may engage in activities which are not healthy. So I believe it's important for all of us and all states to share best practices. And there is a very interesting test case in this arena, which I learned about recently. There is a fellow by the name of Rob Joyce, who is an employee of the National Security Agency. He heads their Tailored Access Operations Department. And this is from what I understand, TAO was unknown until Snowden's revelations were made. There is an interesting Usenix talk. They held a conference, one first of its kind, called Enigma, where they brought in people who were expert in dealing with cyber intrusions. And this Rob Joyce gave an interesting talk. Once my slides are available to you, you'll find that you can go to YouTube and watch a video of the talk that he gave, an open talk. My next topic is multilateral cooperation. There's no doubt that over time, states will experience major damaging incidents in which cyber weapons are found. Now, if a cyber weapon were found inside, let's say, an important part of the electrical grid which has just crashed, and you can't determine what caused the crash, which might have been a squirrel on a power line or a limb during a heavy wind coming down on a power line, you might be inclined to attribute that to the nation whose cyber weapons were discovered in the computer systems at the time of the crash. And if there is attribution to another state, that could lead to escalation of conflict. There's a concept that was introduced a few years back called ESOS. The basic notion here is that if a nation is experiencing a major cyber incident, then it should be able to call upon another nation for assistance in dealing with that, stopping the attack or whatever's causing the disruption, and get help, just as you would if you were at sea and your ship was in danger. My next topic is norms, and I'm going to talk about a government group of experts on information and communication technology norms. They're called GGE norms. We'll then take up norms that have been established between peers of states, and then we'll look at the G20 and the norms that it just endorsed last December. And then the third topic will be industrial norms. In particular, Microsoft is taking the lead, so I'm going to say something about that. I intended to talk about Internet Service Provider norms, on which I've written with Melissa Hathaway, but I didn't actually have time to do a set of slides on that. We'll see if I have time to talk about it. The GGE is an acronym for the UN groups of governmental experts who have come together to formulate positions and offer opinions on cyber threats and ways to cooperate among states. The first meeting concluded in 2004 without a substantive report. In 2010, they said, let's do confidence building, let's do risk reductions, let's do capacity building. But the most interesting of the first three meetings was the third one, which concluded in 2013, and they announced that, in their view, international law applies online as well as offline. Now, the GGE meetings were meetings in the vicinity of 15 to 20 different states, convened by the Secretary General of the United Nations. And they made recommendations which were then brought to the General Assembly, and it was there where they approved these recommendations. So in 2013, the GGE said, international law applies online as well as offline. Although that may sound innocuous, it was actually quite a major step forward. It acknowledged state sovereignty and when it concerns ICT, information and communications technologies. They said states should show respects for human rights and fundamental freedoms, things that, of course, are in the UN Charter. And they said, quote, states must not use proxies to commit internationally wrongful acts and must ensure that their territories are not used by non-state actors for unlawful use of ICTs. Let me explain this to you. When attackers attack a computer system, they typically will compromise a series of machines, and then they'll move from their home machine to the first of these compromised machines, and then from the first to the second, etc., until they land on the machine that they want to penetrate and perhaps exfiltrate information from. These proxies hide the presence of the attacker and make it difficult to discover who's involved. So arguing that states should not use proxies was an important argument. Second, it says that states should not use ensure that their territories are not used by non-state actors for unlawful use of these technologies. And that is a very important point. One that, as it turns out, when I was in the State Department from 2009-10, it occurred to me it wasn't that well received at the time, but within a couple of years, General Hayden was of the opinion that this should be now it's been adopted by the GGE, the United States government, and other governments around the world. The last set of GGE norms were produced last year, December, I think it was. And they came forward with four major recommendations, and I've highlighted in red those words that are most relevant. States must observe international law. We've seen that before. And state sovereignty. Second, existing obligations under international law are applicable to state use of ICTs. Then they have to respect and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. And third point is they must not use proxies to commit international wrongful acts. And then they should ensure that territories not used by non-state actors to commit such acts. Okay. I'd like to turn now to bilateral norms. Russia and China in 2015 agreed to avoid cyber attacks against each other and to counteract technologies that can be used to destabilize, disturb, or interfere with the internal affairs of the state. Here you see a reflection of the priorities of these two countries. They're concerned more about state security than they are about theft of intellectual property, violation of privacy, and things of that sort. Then we have U.S.-China norms, which were agreed with the president between the President of the United States and the President of China last September last year. They both agreed that either country will support a cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property for commercial use. It doesn't preclude theft of intellectual property for intelligence reasons, but for commercial use. And that each should provide assistance to the other. Provide assistance to the other, and mitigate cyber crimes that emanate from their territory. So there you see echoed the GGE recommendation and the 20 recommendation. And the third bullet here is they work together to identify and promote norms for state behavior in cyberspace. This is a very good idea. States should talk together and decide what behavior they consider to be deleterious and should be avoided. And then they finally concluded they're going to establish a high-level dialogue to fight cybercrime and related issues using people who are representatives of the highest cabinet officers in both countries. In 2015, the 20 met, and they made agreements on many points, but one of them was cyber norms. And again, they affirmed that international law applies to state conduct online as well as offline. Second, they asserted that all states should abide by norms of responsible behavior in cyberspace, and that no country should conduct or support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property with the intent of providing competitive advantages to companies or commercial sectors. That's an idea that, of course, a norm that was stated earlier. I'm going to turn now to industrial norms. What's absolutely fascinating is that Microsoft has decided that it's in their corporate interest to propose norms to reduce the possibility of conflict in cyberspace. Now, you may ask, well, why would they be interested in reducing conflict in cyberspace? It's simply because if we have a conflict in cyberspace, there's a risk of doing major damage to economies, to computer systems, to networks. So they have elucidated 6 norms. The first is that states should not target ICT companies to insert vulnerabilities. They're concerned about undermining public trust in products and services. Now, put that in the context of the brouhaha between the Justice Department and Apple concerning encryption. And you see that they anticipated this issue because they've had to deal with it themselves. The second bullet says states, I'm summarizing now, should have a clear principle-based policy for handling product and service vulnerabilities. What they mean by this is that they want those people in government who discover vulnerabilities in commercial products to notify the vendors. They don't like the idea of government stockpiling what I call 0 days or vulnerabilities that have not yet been identified. The third bullet is that the governments should exercise restraint in developing cyber weapons. This is a very important point. The U.S. Department of Defense in December released their Law of War manual, and on page 995 you will see that it refers to cyber weapons and the pre-implantation of cyber weapons, meaning implant them before you engage in a conflict. That is, in my view, escalatory and therefore dangerous. The fourth bullet is that states should commit to non-proliferation activities related to cyber weapons. We know that the Stuxnet worm, which attacked the nuclear refining facility in Natanz, Iran, was designed to stay within the computer systems in Iran, but it escaped and traveled all over the world. It didn't do any damage any place apparently except in Iran, because it was closely targeted to the conditions at that facility. When it didn't find those conditions, it didn't activate. But nonetheless, it illustrates that once you launch a weapon, a cyber weapon, you really don't have a lot of control over where it's to stop or land. And then the fifth bullet is avoid creating a massive event. That's pretty obvious. And then the last bullet says states should assist the private sector efforts to detect, contain, respond to, and recover from events in cyberspace. That's obviously important, but it isn't always recognized by governments that it is important. The Snowden revelations tell us that the United States government, in its zeal to acquire information, which is completely understandable, seemed to go too far, in my opinion, in implanting devices, technology to recover information. And one needs to, as a nation, discuss these issues so that we don't have to deal with the unintended consequences of these actions. We're all human, we're all limited in our ability to imagine how a weapon might be used, how far it might travel, etc. At the Munich Security Conference, which is a conference that brings together policymakers at the highest level of government, like prime ministers, foreign ministers, parliamentarians, senators, Microsoft organized a breakfast meeting and had a panel of a moderator and 5 panelists. And one of the points that the vice president for Microsoft made there that I found very interesting is that he said that Microsoft has decided that it has a duty to notify clients when they are attacked. They also have assumed a duty to assist their clients when this kind of thing happens. That's an interesting development. Several panelists said that high-level attribution, meaning knowing where it comes from, generally perhaps a country, region, maybe an organization within the country is now done very well by a handful of companies. And some of the panelists said, we think that making accusations of malicious behavior is a way that might be used to curb this kind of activity. There was an international lawyer on the panel who was Marina, I've forgotten her family name, but it was the foreign minister for Estonia, and she said cooperation is needed between corporations and governments. She also stated that international law needs to be applied and tested in this arena. She said, she echoed what I said to you earlier, which is international law applies online as well as offline. Her point is that if we do this, this will help to build trust and help to refine the law. A few words about norms versus behavior. They set standards, but they don't guarantee conformance. So one of the issues that G7 can take up is, what steps can we take to encourage conformance? And in which venues might this be done? Let's turn now to the encryption issue. As you probably know, data can be encrypted while it's at rest, meaning sitting on a disk, on a USB drive, what have you, and it can be, of course, encrypted in transit. When you look at data encrypted in transit, often those prosecutors who are dealing with this issue say, we need the encryption key. But there are people who've written on this. I have a paper cited here, Lawful Hacking, using existing vulnerabilities for wiretapping on the internet, in which the authors say, listen, you don't need to break the security of the encryption of data in transit. What you need to do is, what you should do is get into the computer where it's being encrypted or decrypted, and you can do that by using vulnerabilities that exist in computers. And when you do, and you can do that legally. You can do that with a federal warrant, a local warrant. So we have to then ask the question, what is the case for encryption and what is the case against encryption? Well, encryption, good encryption, is essential for government services to protect corporate data, personal data. And if it's not there, if you don't have good solid encryption, then you are at risk of losing corporate secrets. You could put at risk the financial system of the country. You know that the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, a person there told me that $4.5 trillion of funds are cleared every day by that bank. To put that into context, the gross domestic product of the United States is about $16 trillion. And maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when this number was produced, I was told that the undersea cable system carries at least $10 trillion of transactions every day, international cash transfers. So what's the case against encryption? Well, a crisis could be averted, a crime cannot be solved if you can't break it. Let's turn now to the Apple FBI case. The FBI wants Apple to write software and download it, and possibly download firmware to an Apple iPhone to prevent that phone from erasing the encrypted data when too many attempts are made to find the password. So if you type the password in more than 10 times on the 5C or the 6, you will, the first thing that will happen is it will slow down the time between attempts to about an hour. And then if you do it 10 times, try to do it more than 10 times, it'll erase all the memory, the information that's been encrypted. So the FBI has invoked a law passed in 1789. It's called the All Writs Act, so 1789, to force Apple to help it. And this All Writs Act says that the federal courts can issue, quote, issue all writs necessary or appropriate in aid of their respective jurisdictions and agreeable to the usages and principles of law. Apple is being asked to write new software and to download that along with perhaps firmware in order to break the security of the code. It apparently is possible. I've read a piece written by someone who seems to know what they're talking about, who says, yes, this is a possibility. But the question is that a good thing? If if you are selling iPhones in China, and we know that is the case, and a substantial fraction of the profits made by Apple are made in China, and the Chinese government wants to break the security of the iPhone, they may insist that you give them secrets, the software that you've designed, to break the security. And if you don't, they may threaten that you can't sell any more Apple equipment in China. That's a legitimate threat, in my opinion. It's a real threat. So if the U.S. vendor can force a vendor of computer equipment to create access for it, namely a backdoor, so can state courts and foreign governments. So they would all have to have the backdoor. And the important thing to remember is the bad guys have access to really secure encryption. And regardless of which matter what U.S. policy is, they're going to have that. Whereas Americans may not if the FBI prevails. So that's a very important issue we have to reflect on. There are two possible solutions to this problem. The U.S. can find and exploit vulnerabilities in iPhones. All right? Every computer system, every system created by man has got some kind of vulnerability. But if that doesn't work, then the U.S. government could try to write its own iPhone replacement software to break in. And you can do reverse engineering. There are a lot of things you can do. And if you have the time and the money, I think they could write their own software. But in that case, the software would be in the hands of the U.S. government, not in the hands of Apple. And then Apple can't be commanded to turn it over. I want to spend a few more minutes here talking about something called the IANA transition. This is for me, a very troubling issue. It's an issue that's hot, that's been decided this year. It involves the question of who is going to have supervisory control over the core elements of the domain name system. What's the domain name system? Well, when you and I use our computers, we type in our browser what's called a URL, Universal Resource Locator, like www.harvard.edu. And that has that string, has that domain name, has to be converted into a string of bits so that the packets that will carry our communications can be sent through the network. Well, up until this time, the Department of Commerce, through its Networking and Telecommunications Information Administration, NTIA, has control over the changes that are made in the root zone file. This is in some sense an acronym because when the United States government put the internet effectively into the public domain by creating the Internet Corporation signing numbers ICANN and ICANN in 1998 under the Clinton administration, what it said at that time was they were eventually going to relinquish control of the domain name system, but for the time being, they were going to use the Department of Commerce to serve as a check on the changes made in what's called the root zone file. This is a smallish file in which is kept a mapping between what are called generic top-level, not generic, but top-level domain names. So .ru for Russia. If you have an address, a new name that you never translated into a binary string before on your computer, and it ends in .ru, such as Kaspersky.ru, your machine will consult with a domain name resolver in your internet service provider. If they can't translate it, they will go to a root zone server, and they will say, give me the IP address for a machine that can translate names ending in .ru. So the result will go to that machine and say, please translate Kaspersky.ru, and back will come a binary string, which is the string that will be used to communicate with Kaspersky.ru. Okay, so there is a set of what are called IANA, Internet Assigned Number Authority functions that are performed by ICANN. IANA is the name actually of a department at ICANN. And what they do is they manage the changes, they collect the changes that they propose be made in the root zone file. They also assign numbers to protocols. So if someone invents a new protocol like voice over IP, when packets are sent using that protocol, there is a number associated with VoIP that's embedded in the header of the packets. They also, IANA functions also include assigning numbers and keeping track of the numbers that are given to what are called anonymous systems. So we have something like 40 to 50,000 organizations that manage networks of computers and assign domain names and IP addresses they call autonomous systems. And each one has a number, and that number is used when one autonomous system is communicating with a neighbor one. So NTIA was under some pressure from the international community to liberate its supervision of the root zone file, because countries were concerned that because they control the root zone file, if there were a disagreement between, let's say, Russia and the United States, the fear was that the mapping from .ru to a domain name would be removed from the file, and then it would not be possible for someone wanting to communicate with Russia to do that. So they put pressure on the United States government. In March 2014, the NTIA administrator says, we're willing to give up our supervision of the root zone file, but we insist that it be taken over by a multi-stakeholder body in which there was no governmental involvement. They set a few other conditions. They then turned to ICANN itself and said, please create a process for making this transfer. And ICANN created an intercommunity group, and that group commissioned 2 studies, one on stewardship called the Cross-Community Working Group on Stewardship, and another on accountability. So who is this? To whom is ICANN going to be accountable if it's no longer accountable to NTIA? It's somewhat complex, but it's important, as you'll see. So what they did is they created this IANA Stewardship Transition Coordination Group. There, in this area, there's a people seem to like to create these very complicated, long names. And then they assign a short acronym like ICG. And so they created a 30-member ICG, ICANN did, and it created its membership from a number of ICANN's advisory committees, organizations. It went outside to the Internet Engineering Task Force, to the Internet Society, and to a few others. But they created these 2 cross-community working groups, one on stewardship, one on accountability. The first one on stewardship submitted its report in October 2015. The accountability group produced a report at the end of November, and it's been under discussion since then. They're coming close to completing it. The stewardship group said, all right, basically we're not going to make any changes in ICANN itself, except that we're going to take the IANA department and we're going to move it outside, and we're going to call it the post-transition IANA, PTI. It's going to be a new legal entity wholly owned by ICANN. And then it set up a couple of review bodies. The accountability recommendations are really very interesting and, I view, dangerous. They propose to give to the committees and supporting organizations that are part of ICANN responsibility to reject the budget submitted by the board, reject operating and strategic plans. They're going to give these subunits of ICANN the right to reject the changes in the bylaws proposed by the board. They will have the right to remove board members and the entire board. But there is one provision that they have added that I find I don't understand well enough, but what I do understand of it is alarming. There is a committee of ICANN called the Government Advisory Committee, and they are proposing that any advice offered by the Government Advisory Committee has to be accepted by the board unless the board unless 2/3 of the board members vote against it. Now, so you look, I have issues with these last set of recommendations. So what's important to do is to look at how these advisory committees and supporting organizations work. And what you find is that they make up their own rules. The rules under which they operate are under their control, not under ICANN's control, and they can be changed. The Government Advisory Committee's rules, this Government Advisory Committee is a committee that allows any national or regional government to have a seat, meaning you can have ASEAN, APEC, OECD, Council of Europe, as well as France, Germany, England, Russia, Moldova, all can join the Government Advisory Committee. But their rules of operation are fuzzy. The word advice is not defined. And if you read their principles of operation, which are online, you'll see the second principle says, quote, the GAC is not a decision-making body. So I ask myself, how can they offer advice if they can't make decisions? Well, the implied in the statement is that they're always going to arrive at consensus. But we know, but if you look at how these committees function, they function the way the chair wants them to function. They're called when the chair wants them to be called. And so I look at this and say, is this any way to manage the domain name system? I don't think so. I think that there's a risk, not imminent, but I think there's a risk long time that the domain system, name system may not stay in good hands. Now there's this big question that's been debated for some time now about what models are most appropriate for internet governance. Because we're dealing with governments, we're dealing with the private sector, the computer industry, the internet has been put together by a lot of volunteers, almost from day one. It was started as a research project at the DARPA, but when it left DARPA, it left DARPA because it was rapidly evolving. DARPA, being a research organization, did not want to be dealing day-to-day with decisions. So they split it off and eventually was expected to fall into private hands. But Bruce McCall, who's at the East West Institute, and I'm affiliated there, have examined this question, examined multi-stakeholder governance, and have, we are recommending that you should take internet governance and not try to resolve all the internet governance issues in one forum, but rather you should disaggregate them into areas that can be given to pre-existing pre-existing international bodies like the World Trademark Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the Human Rights Council, things of that sort. When you do that, you're left primarily with the ICANN and IANA functions. And we've got some recommendations there, but one model for governance that people need to talk about and think about is the International Civil Aviation Organization. At the moment, the only two models that are seriously considered by governments are what's called the multi-stakeholder model, where presumably every stakeholder has a voice. That's never the case. Or the multilateral model, where states make decisions. And when they say states make decisions, what is assumed is that the International Telecommunications Union, which has been around since 1865, and stands for the telephone industry, the telegraph industry before that, will take over. And that body, every state has one vote. Here with the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, they have a 37-member council, and it is representative of the majority of nations. They have also an organization called Air Navigation Commission, which is a technical body. And when it makes technical decision, it can't be changed by the council, but it can be rejected. So if they declare, for example, that an airport is not safe to land because the radar is not working properly, no commercial airline and the insurance company won't let it. So it's an interesting model ought to be studied in this context. Let me conclude, almost done, but I want to talk about the Munich Security Conference. One slide on this, and we'll come forward with solutions. That was occurred on the weekend of February 11, 2013. One of the most important developments was that the Prime Minister of Russia, Medvedev, early in his speech, said that he saw us entering a new Cold War, which I took to be ominous. Another highlight was the discussion of the Syrian Civil War. Secretary Kerry had negotiated in Munich with the Russians and with the Syrians on both sides of this, as well as European states. And he came forward with a generally positive assessment. Senator McCain was not persuaded that was the right path. And the third highlight for me was the Microsoft breakfast on cyber norms. So let me close with some proposed agenda items for the G7, 2016 G7s. First, nation states, I believe, and the private sector should be jointly committing themselves to the hard work of developing and implementing cyber norms. So states and the major corporations who are offering products all over the world where cybersecurity is an issue should be at the table. I'm a big believer that when it comes time to formulate policy that has a technology dimension, that you should have the technologists at the table. The second bullet here is, are defensive norms necessary? Should we be ruling out, just as we do on the field of battle, we say that ambulances should not be attacked? Should we declare that attacks against the critical infrastructure of a nation, on which a nation depends for its water, its food, its health, should that be a legitimate target? Right now, from what I've read, nation states are talking about destroying critical infrastructures. The third bullet, are risk reduction norms needed? Is there a threat that's sufficiently serious that we should have norms directed toward risk reduction? The fourth bullet is, what offensive norms are prudent? Should we declare that nuclear reactors and nuclear missile command and control centers are off limits? And you can ask yourself, why would that be the case? Well, if you were planning on attacking a nuclear missile command and control center, and you do so thinking it's only going to take a flash of a finger, flick of a finger to destroy it, but in fact, it takes 15 months to figure out how the system works and how you're going to implant the software, and you get caught in the middle of it while you're not done. You create a situation that's very tense. So, how should corporations and nation states cooperate in this area? So, my next to last bullet, and the last one is, what's a good guiding philosophy for internet? This is a complex problem that involves nation states, it involves personal egos. It's hard. So I think these are all very interesting questions. They no doubt climate they actually pose, but I think it's a good starting point. Finally, my last slide has a set of sources that was used to talk, and the others if you're interested. Thank you. Like that? Good. So we have some questions. I can address those.
Yeah. Please add it. No.
Okay. Marcus move on. So he had to leave. He said, so perhaps I can take.
So I can review. That is more or less for you. This is my question. So the first study you can we will look at the question from audience, maybe with people. Yeah. So yes.
Read the question.
The question you can use the first US study is very important.
Right. So Bill Gertz has got a question here. He says, what is your view of using proactive, offensive cyber operations against cyber attackers? I'm not a big fan of that, and the reason is that if you take proactive, offensive operations, you run the risk of doing damage to yourself. Before the Gulf War was launched, it's reported that the Bush administration was considering destroying the banking system in Iraq as a way to neutralize the Saddam Hussein's administration. And it didn't do that because it realized before it launched the attack that this might destroy the banking system in France because they were using the French banking system. This question suggests to me the possibility of what's known as a hackback. What's a hackback? That's where you get hacked, somebody breaks into your computer, you find them, and then you look at the tools they're using, and you say, hey, those tools have some vulnerabilities, so why don't I put I hack them? Well, this notion of hacking back, or using, let's say, private individuals to do damage against another party, that idea is very old. During the Revolutionary War in this country, the United States issued letters of marque and reprisal, they were called. Letters of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, and reprisal to ship owners, several hundred of them, at a time when I think we had 30 or 40 ships in the U.S. Navy. And they were allowed under U.S. law to go out and seize the ships belonging to the English government or English-owned ships, seize their cargo, and they were told to give some of it back to the government, but the rest was theirs for having taken the risk to stop these ships at sea. If you had so letters of marque and reprisals led eventually to piracy. And eventually the piracy problem became so bad that all of the seafaring nations decided they had to stop. And so it's no longer done. So if we had hackers who were hacking back in this country, corporations, security firms doing that kind of thing, another country could not tell whether the hacker was a government hacker or not. And so they can lead to misunderstandings and escalation and danger. We have a question from Alan Citron.
Yeah, Alan Citron. Very important.
And he says, during the Cold War, the concepts of mutually assured destruction and detente created a framework for coexistence despite disagreement and conflicting goals. Might there be analogous concepts in the cyber realm that would be a component strategy for dealing with cyber terrorism? If not, why not? And if so, what would be needed to realize this? Well, we don't have the equivalent of mutually assured destruction today, although we might. There is talk publicly of using cyber weapons to disable another country's nuclear command and control centers. And that would represent mutually assured destruction if they were to be used this way. I think that put it this way, the best cyber deterrence is a good cyber defense. If you have built a system that is secure as it can be, and you've done your backups, and meaning your data is off on a remote site, so if your site gets damaged, it still can rebuild your network and your data. That's better than trying to win in a cyber conflict. He also asked what legal or cultural barriers might there be to improving cyber defense and response. Are there formal industry, academic, or government-sponsored initiatives to identify and address these? Yes, there are legal or cultural barriers to improving. There are some. I mean, information sharing between corporations in the U.S. has been a problem in the past. The Computer Information Sharing Act was passed in November, last November, by the U.S. government, which allows companies to share information without having it running into antitrust terms. So we are addressing those things. His third question is, many weaknesses in cyber defense today arise from the consequences of generations of striving for open, interoperable architecture. Are there trends to change this? And if not, should there be? And if so, how can this be done to strike the best balance between security and financial/operational efficiency? Well, the open and interoperable architectures are not a weakness in my opinion, the internet. They're a strength. And we have seen an enormous amount of innovation result on the internet, primarily because you can connect to the internet without obtaining permission from anyone. When we used to rely solely on the telephone networks in our countries, the people who operated these networks, which was primarily AT&T in this country, they decided that you could not attach any equipment to their network unless you had met their requirements. So they kept a lockdown on the addition of technologies and stymied innovation. The open internet has led to a tremendous amount of innovation. I am convinced that we are going to be able to solve our problems with cybercrime. Not solve completely, we're going to be able to mitigate to a sufficient extent the problems we're having with crime, with state-on-state hacking and theft. We're going to be able to deal with all those issues. I have another question from Llewellyn King. He's got 4 or 5 questions. Is deterrence a possibility? Is the first question. In other words, if you attack our cyber infrastructure, we will annihilate yours. I certainly don't hope that doesn't happen, because I don't want our if you annihilated our cyber infrastructure, if it were annihilated by the other side, meaning they destroy enough electrical power generators and transformers so that we don't have the manufacturing capacity to replace them, and we go for 3, 4, 5 years before we bring the electricity back up to the level it is today, the number of deaths are going to mount. The economy is going to go into a tailspin. It's going to die, and this is going to happen all over the world. We go back 200 years, and to me, that's not something we want or should tempt. The second question is, if countries sign on to a code of conduct, will their own intelligence agencies abide by it? That's a very good question, and it's seen by the behavior of Western intelligence agencies. We don't know the answer to that question, really, because it hasn't been put to the test. Our intelligence agencies have engaged in activities without discussing them in advance with the civil authorities openly. So the civil society has not had a chance to vet these. Third question, how are countries supposed to react when they find that they're inadvertently hosting a cyber terrorist? Well, if you find that you're hosting a cyber terrorist, I'd say put them in jail. Should big countries like the US lend their cyber detection experts and equipment and expertise to get to another country? Should we help them? Because there's a risk that it will blow back on us, that they will use their experience to attack us. I'm not worried about that. I think that we all benefit by raising the level of security. And if we move in the other direction and think we're going to keep some of these secrets to ourselves, I think we're all going to pay for that in the end. What role can international organizations like the OECD, the EU, or even the UN play? Well, I've shown you that the UN has convened these meetings of the GGE. They are convening the Internet Governance Forum, which is a great place to bring people together to learn about the Internet and to formulate strategies. The fifth question he has is, will those abiding by an international agreement suffer from having their hands tied while others undercut the agreement? I've never believed that being a good guy and observing international law is a bad thing or dangerous. I think you have to be responsive to threats, and you have to treat them realistically, but I don't think you should worry about being a good guy and following the law. From Bill Ottman, 2 questions. What is your analysis of the overwhelming public support for Apple not to put back doors into smartphones? I think I've addressed that already. The second question is, what are some clear steps the U.S. could take to simultaneously increase transparency and security? On that score, I mentioned Rob Joyce, who is the head of the Tailored Access Operations branch of the National Security Agency, who got up in a public environment. This is a man whose job is to try to obtain the secrets that are being held by foreign governments. His purpose is to penetrate the most secret, most hardened computers of other nations and bring back the secrets. And yet he got up No doubt with the approval of his superiors at the National Security Agency and probably the President of the United States, and gave a talk at this conference, giving some good tips, not the most intimate details, but some good tips on how to make computers more secure. So you see, he represented an optimistic point of view of the United States government towards security. Help everybody, and we'll help ourselves. On that note, I'm ready to take any other questions that might have come in. Tuan?
Already, as you see already, so I think Will Hoffman has it. Okay, finished, and we have some another question from audience, but that is some question that is same meaning.
We'll save them for later and later.
And also another question. So another question, I think, by the why the different with our topic to talk today. So I think that enough, and also we have 1 hour already.
Sure.
Okay.
Right, that's great. All right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very good, and wonderful topic.
Thank you. It's nice being with you.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk and wonderful presentation and ideas, and for special for G7 Summit. Yeah, G7 Summit was wonderful, and also I think very good and systematically knowledge and information and everything about cybersecurity norms and standards, and that is very important for Boston Global Forum to develop a PGF G7 Summit initiative to submit for G7 Summit in Japan this May. Yes, and we continue. This is very important talk and important guidance and support and help us and lead us to discuss the next section to build the initiative.
That's great.